Chair, you can call the meeting to order.
Sounds good. I'd like to go ahead and call the meeting to order for the North Miami Citizens Investigative Board, calling the meeting at 6:04 p.m.
And then Mr. Pierre, you can roll call.
Was Michelle Pierre
Present.
Andre D. Pierre,
Either absent or excused. Okay.
Karen Syfe, and our chair, Mr. Randy Rice,
Here.
Rabbi Joey Lane, absent. Yeah. And
That's it. You don't call.
yeah, because on my board, right? That's it, cool. And I think,
So, Mr. Chair, at this time, you don't have quorum, but you can go ahead and proceed with presentations, which you have introduction of some guests. We have Mr. Lee Reed, who's here from Atlanta. He's Executive Director for the CIB in Atlanta, Georgia. And Mr. Robbie Jacobs was arriving. So let me see that. The number required is 12.
A majority of our board. So if you have one more person, we'll have 5 of us to make a point.
Quorum isn't a set number.
No, just the majority of whatever the amount of the board is.
So, Mr. Lee, hold on one second. Let me send Rodney this link because it looks like he wants to run it via Zoom. Hold on one second. Go right ahead, Mr. Lee. You can go ahead and get started and introduce yourself to the group. You're muted right now.
Okay. Good evening, everyone. My name is Lee Reed, Executive Director of the Atlanta Citizen Review Board. Thank you, Dr. Harris, for allowing me to speak to the CIB tonight. You know, I think it's great news to hear that North Miami has started a CIB because, you know, the more that we can grow these civilian oversights across the nation, the better. I mean, there's strength in numbers, and each community should be looking at one, and I just applaud you all for taking that step. I want to definitely say it's good to see that you have volunteers who are on the board, who are in for an exciting ride as they start doing the work of civilian oversight. I've been in this field for since 2006. I was in Minneapolis, Minnesota, doing it for 6 years, and then I moved here to Atlanta, Georgia, to do it since 2012. It's exciting work. It's work that's definitely challenging. And one thing I want to just leave with you guys is that always stay committed to your process and understanding that you're never going to make everyone happy, because this is a situation where, you know, you have competing interests on both sides. So the best thing is just be true to your process. They can have a problem with the decision because of where they're coming from. But as long as you're true to the process, they can never have a problem with the way that you're doing your work. So I would say just be committed to your process. Oh, and the other thing that I do want to mention, I know Dr. Harris was mentioning earlier that you guys are out in the community today at I think a recreation center, I believe. And that's good. I mean, because quite often we do this work in City Hall or in the government building or something like that. Um, One of the best things you can do as an oversight agency is always stay connected to the community. Here in Atlanta, we dedicate three meetings a month to be in the community, to where we have those meetings outside of City Hall, and we try to do that every 3 months or so. So we'll be kicking that back in gear in 2023. So really, that's all I wanted to say. I just wanted to say congratulations, and I'm glad to be here tonight. And so, if there are any questions that I can answer, I certainly entertain those. Thank you.
Lee. Thank you, Lee, so much. I really appreciate you as a colleague. As we know, sometimes it gets lonely out here in this work. So it's great to have colleagues that we can reach far in other states, but also right in our backyard. And so with that being said, we have my other colleague with the CIP, who's with the city of Miami. But also the great thing that we have the pleasure of in our market is that Mr. Rodney Jacobs also serves as our new board member with NACO, which is our national association. And so I'm gonna bring Rodney up to introduce himself to you. Hey, Rodney.
Good evening, everyone. And it's good to see you, Lee. I don't think we got to run into each other this year at NACO, so definitely good to see you here with us tonight. You know, Lee is definitely one of the leaders in our community, so anytime you have the opportunity to pick his brain on some of the good work they're doing in Atlanta, it's always time well served. I see our esteemed Cami McKinney here as well, and she's also fabulous and amazing. So, you know, you got a good group of people here, Dr. Harris. So, you know, I feel like anything that they've said, I'm just going to echo the same sentiments. You know, congratulations really to your team, Dr. Harris, to getting this far. I mean, you know, you guys have been on this road now for some time, and you stayed the course, and you were able to not only get a panel, but then to obviously get the staff and get the working legislation done. So kudos to you and your team, especially down here in South Florida. We have a different layer of complexities we deal with, and you've been able to navigate those seamlessly. So all the credit to you and your team. Obviously, as you mentioned, you know, definitely feel free to use me as a resource. Our office has been around since 2000 here in the city of Miami, and you know, your department in many ways mirrors ours. So not only do you have me to rely on, I have you guys as well, but we also shortly we'll have a county oversight department. So, you know, oversight's growing here in South Florida, and I think all of us are going to be able to work in tandem to kind of nurture this profession, ensure that it'll be here for years to come. I often like to say I'm trying to work myself out of a job. I don't. Hopefully, we won't need oversight in the next decade. We'll find a way to utilize this vehicle of oversight to get to something other than the current community policing relationship that we have. I'm confident that we can do that. I'm even more confident knowing that you guys are in the north and we have the county and you have me in the south. So thank you so much for inviting me tonight. I will say to the panel members that it is definitely going to be a hard road, but it's definitely a rewarding road. And as long as you stay the course, you keep in mind the real work that this panel impacts, and you will see the benefit from it. I often, you know, tell my staff that, you know, we're going to remain as practical as possible. We're going to hunt the good stuff, and we're going to try to find the wins. In dealing with our community and sometimes dealing with politics and a whole host of things, you know, winning sometimes doesn't always look like being right, and sometimes you have to concede to a couple no's and a lot of your wrongs or whatever it may be to kind of get to the end goal of the win. that looks like real police oversight, transparency, and allowing the community to engage with their police department in meaningful ways that promote real public safety and not policing as usual. So I'm excited for what you guys are about to embark on in North Miami, and just know you have me as a resource.
Thank you, Rodney, so much. Really appreciate that. So again, Rodney, it's a pleasure again to have him represented on our national board. Maybe our board, maybe one day as we're starting up and so forth, that we may want to come do a field trip down there for one of your board meetings. Correctly as a board, to come just see how you run and function and see how your cases go. I think that's something that all of us, including our staff, that have an opportunity to do that. I just want to have an opportunity, Rodney, as well as Lee, to allow my two other colleagues just to introduce themselves to you as I've been expanding a little bit here. So allow Deandra to introduce herself.
Hi, Deandra.
How you doing? I think I met her before, or was it someone else? I can't remember
I came
exactly.
to your office, to shadow your office that one day.
Yeah, I was about to say I think we've met a few times.
Yes.
And then now we have our contracted investigator on our team officially. Mr. Hope, you want to introduce yourself?
Reginald Hope, how you doing?
How you doing, Mr. Hoke? Pleasure.
Good.
Good to meet you.
That being said, everyone, we have our other Cammy yesterday. As you know, we went around the room, we had individuals introduce themselves. So I want to allow our other board member who just arrived, and I'm going to let the record reflect that 6:13 that Andrea Pierre just arrived, and then at 6:07, our 6:07, right? Yes, 6:07, our Vice Chair Rabbi Lang arrived. So we do have official quorum to conduct any other additional business that we need to conduct. So I'll allow them to introduce themselves, which Rodney, I know you know very well as the first chair of the CIP in Miami.
Thank you, Dr. Harris. For the record, that Rabbi and I, we on the same block, so we have, we have to go from east to west, and 125th Street, that traffic is killing us. So
I told them yesterday about your windows, Christmas.
right. Again, thank you so much for having me. If you guys remember back maybe 20, 25 years ago, I was one of the first board members for the city of Miami civilian investigative panel. I served there for so many years, so I'm glad that I was able to get appointed by the city of North Miami to serve on this board. So pleasure to be here.
Excellent. So if there's any questions that you all may want to ask to our special guests, and if not, then we can jump to Cammy, continue forward to pick up where we left off yesterday and moving forward with today. Any questions? All right. Thank you, Rodney and Lee. You can stay on or you can jump off with whatever, your family. So
Absolutely. Well, I'm here if you guys ever need me. Dr. Harris, obviously you have my number. Let me know when the next meeting is. Definitely want to try to make it in person. I wrapped up, double booked, and scheduled too much going on tonight. But I'll definitely try to make it to the next one. And you obviously are all welcome to come to our meetings. They're live stream on TV. They're also on the city website, but you can come see it in person in the Coconut Grove at City Hall if you feel free.
I'll probably stay on for a few minutes before I bounce out.
thank you.
Good seeing you, Rodney and Lee.
Yes, Rodney. Take care, brother. I'll talk to you later.
Absolutely. Take care. Good seeing you.
Okay, well, thank you. It's good to be back with all of you again tonight. I'm actually I know we were going to finish some stuff that we were going to talk about last night. Before we do that, I'm going to actually do the training that we had planned for tonight. And then we can circle back to the piece of conducting oversight in North Miami. I know that you have, Dr. Harris, is it the next meeting that the attorney is coming to talk about the ordinance?
That's part 3. So that's going to be on 12.
Yeah, so we'll try to get to some of it tonight, but I also think we'll be able to piggyback on what the attorney is talking about on that night as well. But I also want to make sure that we get to the information that was planned for tonight. So with that, I am going, forgive me while I take a moment to share my screen. Okay, so the first thing I want to do is see if any of you had additional questions from what we covered last night. Okay. Well, either I covered it so well that there are no more questions, or maybe some will come to you later, particularly as we go into this evening's information. So tonight we're going to be talking about 3 different things. We're going to be talking about principles for effective civilian oversight. Excuse me. We're going to talk about strategies for community engagement. And then we're going to wrap things up for the second module with talking about effective reporting practices. So let's jump first into the 13 principles for effective civilian oversight. So several years ago, NACOL put together a list of what it feels are the principles that guide effective oversight. Now, we weren't the first ones to come up with principles for oversight. There have been others before us. Most of those people, either academics in the field of oversight or practitioners of oversight, people like some of them, you may recognize the names of Sam Walker, Joseph DeAngelis, Barbara Tard, Richard Rosenthal, people who've been around civilian oversight for quite some time and have really looked at the work. What we've done is kind of looked at all of those things, compiled what we feel are kind of the top of things that need to be considered, and added a few extras to really talk about what we need to be considering when we're talking about effective civilian oversight of law enforcement. So there are 13 of them that we have compiled, and I'm going to go through each one of these fairly quickly this evening, but there is a report on our website called that we recently put out through a grant with the COPS office that is the current state of the field and effective practices in civilian oversight of law enforcement. All of this can also be found there, and additional examples of how these different principles might look in practice. We'll talk through some of those examples tonight, but there's a lot more information there if you're interested. And I think it's also important to stop and say why we call them effective practices in civilian oversight rather than best practices, because I get asked all the time, so what are the best practices? What do I need to put in place so that I can be the best kind of oversight? And the problem with developing a set of best practices is that the field of oversight has expanded in a very as we learned last night, slow, somewhat sporadic, and very decentralized manner. All of them look different. There are no standards for the way information is gathered from agency to agency, which makes it very difficult to do cross comparison and actually develop research on what is working best and what isn't. So what we did over the course of several years was to go out into the field, talk to civilian oversight practitioners, see what was working for them, and of course what wasn't working for them, to develop a list of effective practices. If you do have a chance to look at the report, there's about 70 some effective practices listed. This is by no means an exhaustive list. This is just the first step in our process of continuing to develop effective practices and eventually start talking about those standards that we want to implement in the field of civilian oversight. So at the top of our list is independence. So independence is incredibly important to civilian oversight, but it's also very important to remember that there are different types of independence. It is almost impossible to have 100% independence in civilian oversight because you're an extension of the government. You're funded by the government. You rely on government employees, city government employees to do the work. And so there's always kind of little things here and there. There is one civilian oversight entity that is getting ready to be what may be the first truly independent agency. And even then, they receive money from the city government for their budget. But then that's the end. The city doesn't tell them how to spend it. They hire their own staff. And I will say that this is very experimental, and they are just now getting ready to appoint their first board. And so I cannot wait to come back a year from now and let all of you know how that experiment is going. We're all kind of holding our breaths a little bit. But
Which
back,
agency, what city, what
it's
municipality?
the new agency in Cleveland,
Cleveland.
the Cleveland Police Commission, Community Police Commission. So when we're talking about independence, there are really three different types I want to cover. So there's structural independence, which is really about the civilian oversight agency being clearly and distinctly separate, either administratively or organizationally, from the overseeing law enforcement agency. And it's not obligated to report to political bodies that are inextricably related to the law enforcement organization. So if you think about a city's organizational chart, trying to not be in the same line as the law enforcement agency is what we're talking about here. There's also political independence, and that refers to the extent to which political actors can influence you in the work that you're doing. And then we also have operational or procedural independence. And so even where oversight is structurally independent and largely insulated from political influence, an oversight agency that lacks control over its operations can be weakened. So someone who is constantly being told, who they can hire. If Dr. Harris wasn't able to hire his own staff, and that was all very dependent on political entities, that would be an example of not being operationally or procedurally independent. And before we move on to this next one, I also think that it's important to remember that in many of these things, real and perceived are both almost equally important. If you are perceived to not be independent, it can have the same effect as not actually being independent. So it's really important for you, as you're doing community engagement, which we're going to talk about later, that you are setting those expectations very clearly of where your reporting lines are, what kind of independence, what do you do when you're trying to be influenced politically, how do you respond to crisis situations. All of those things, setting those expectations will help people understand the realities of your independence rather than making assumptions and having perceptions of it. So the next principle is clearly defined in adequate jurisdiction and authority. So you have to have the authority that's sufficient to meet stakeholder and community expectations and needs. They have to be clear enough to prevent conflicting interpretations as down the line. Combining oversight functions and responsibilities as necessary and feasible. And then this requires stakeholders to answer key questions regarding the role of oversight. So it is about making sure that everybody is on the same page. And it's particularly important when you're in an area where, for instance, you have 3 oversight agencies right there, particularly once Miami-Dade is up and running fully. And people may try to understand your oversight mechanism through the lens of another, what they already know. So it's important that everybody, political actors, government employees all have a clear understanding of your jurisdiction and authority. Law enforcement needs to know that too. The next one is unfettered access to records. And I should also include in here facilities, because we also talk about this in relation to those who do oversight of jails and prisons. So certain oversight entities have to have a minimum of information to meet their mandate. However, it's also important to remember that most agencies' access to records are in some way affected by state statute and collective bargaining agreements. So it's important to know what you can and cannot have access to in the work. And then when you can have that access, that it is unfettered, that it is easy to gain so that there is no delay, because it's not just about getting the access, it's also about getting it in a timely and reliable manner. In some cities, DC is an example, they actually have a liaison at the police department who is the person that they always contact when they need records, so that there's consistency in the process. Everyone knows what to expect, and it seems to move fairly smoothly. The next one is access to law enforcement executives and internal affairs staff. So it will be important to have access to law enforcement. Sustained dialogue, communication between law enforcement and the oversight stakeholders promote cooperation and ensures that those involved can develop mutual understanding and support for each other's role. It's not about working in a vacuum, because you have to have access and a relationship with them to be able to do the work. And so making sure you have that access up front and is very important. Or in some cases, oversight doesn't come into a friendly environment. In some cases, there's a little bit of hostility, a little bit of, closing doors. And so in those cases, it's about building those relationships so that you can then get better access to law enforcement executives and IA. The next one is full cooperation. So cooperation of uniformed and civilian staff is absolutely necessary for effective oversight. If they're not cooperating, you can't do your job. And the fact that you have fairly strict time limitations in your ordinance means full cooperation is necessary so that you can meet those time limits that are mandated. Some civilian oversight entities go as far as including mandates about cooperation, like for instance in Chicago with the Civilian Office of Police Accountability. They in the Chicago Police General Orders, it says it shall be the duty of every officer, employee, department, and agency of the city to cooperate with COPA in any investigation undertaken pursuant to this chapter. Any employee who violates any provision of this chapter shall be subject to discipline, including but not limited to discharge. So you don't have that at this point, but I like to always tell people that that does exist out in the world, and is when you have a situation where there isn't cooperation, there are cities that have examples of how they've kind of helped cooperation along. And I think that's a good point to say, I'm very glad that Lee and Rodney were able to join this evening. I've had the honor of knowing them for many years, and they are living proof of what I feel is the best part of the civilian oversight community. It is very much like a family, and everybody is more than willing to provide information and assistance. And in some cases, just a little amateur therapy sessions when needed. But they don't want anyone to have to reinvent the wheel. And so they're more than willing to give information. If you want to start a mediation program, there is someone in the oversight world that, you know, I could give you 4 names of people who have really great mediation programs that they've built from scratch. And I can give those to you. They will be more than happy to share their notes on how they did it, what worked, what didn't. So very much keep that in mind, that there's some amazing resources out there and always willing to help. So the next principle, moving on, is sustained stakeholder support. So establishing support for civilian oversight may be politically expedient in the moment of a crisis, but successful oversight requires the sustained support of interest of stakeholders who value independence, accountability, and transparency in their law enforcement agency. And maintaining productive relationships, even when you're in times of disagreement and conflict, that's unavoidable. But it will be, maintaining those relationships even in those times will be crucial to future problem solving, cooperation, and collaboration. And there also may always, I mean, those points of conflict are going to happen. In some cities, it ends up being less than others, but working on the relationship with stakeholders, and those stakeholders, that's not just law enforcement or elected officials, your community members, media, they're all stakeholders in this process. And working with all of them and ensuring those relationships is incredibly important. And although it sounds a little dramatic, it's also important to your survival. There are cities, New Orleans is a great example. After they were formed, they had very little independence at all because they fell under the Inspector General's role, and they found themselves with reports that the IG was trying to rewrite for them, recommendations that were trying to be rewritten. And because of the friction, there was also some difficulty in getting adequate funding for the office. Because of the relationships that the office had built with community members and stakeholders, other stakeholders over time, once the word was out, they all came and they all fought for independence for the office and to make sure that they were adequately funded to carry out their mandate. I'm sure that, Andre, from back in your years on the CIP at that time was an excellent example of how you could try to starve an agency out of existence by lessening its budget. And so having people out there who are kind of following you, helping you, is a way to try to reverse some of those situations. And speaking of trying to starve an agency, the next principle is adequate funding and resources. So unfortunately, I do not believe that there's an oversight entity out there that would complain about being overfunded and overstaffed. It just doesn't happen. There is just not the mandates that are given to oversight entities are very broad. It is heavy work. And they're rarely given adequate resources to do it. Or in some cases, as you all are familiar there, they say, well, let's see what kind of work you've got first, and then we'll see how much money you need. And so until all of that happens, you're kind of scrambling to get the work done. So it is really important to demand that adequate funding is given. I know that in your ordinance that it says that you'll have no more than 1.5% of the police operational budget, which having a percentage allotted is great, because then as the police department grows, you can grow as well. However, it is also, when you have it, what I wish for you in the next incarnation of the ordinance is that is a basement rather than a ceiling. so that as new things and ideas come up, that you can have additional funds to make those happen.
And Cami, to that point,
Mhm.
the reason why you would probably want that to be the basement would be ideally based upon data in itself. And so as a board and as an operational from staff, it really depends on how cases may evolve. It depends on how our operational flow of work in itself, because we wouldn't be able to go to our elected officials of our governing body to adjust that to our budget, as well as the city manager, related to the fact that we don't have data to really true. So that's something to kind of make note before we start going and say, okay, let's do this as and let that be our basement. And I'm pretty sure Lee could attest to that, and Miami would do the same. We know that Miami-Dade's at 1.5 million and the city of Miami is 1.3. That's based upon data in itself, helping justify the budget and performance measures.
Absolutely. Thanks for adding that, Dr. Harris. The next principle is public reporting and transparency. So I cannot emphasize enough how important public reports are. This is how you get information out into the world. It's how you make sure there's information always accessible about your agency out there. It is a way, well, I often like to compare it to what you're trying to do with law enforcement. One of the goals is to try to bring transparency to what's otherwise a very opaque process and agency in most cases. Being the opposite of that by providing public reports, by talking about the recommendations you're making, by talking about how those recommendations were received, whether they were implemented, and then also being very honest about what the effects of the implementation were over time. Talking about the number of cases, the dispositions. And I always have to put the disclaimer of all things allowed by law, but as much as possible is really important, and making sure on your website that all of that is easy to access for as many years as possible. I'm sure not everyone does this, but I spend a lot of time online looking for annual reports of civilian oversight agencies. And I can't tell you how frustrating it is when all of a sudden a year or two have dropped off to make room for the newer reports, because there was, for instance, I was looking for a report after a mediation program was formed, and a really great mediation program, and I wanted to show it to somebody, and now it's nearly impossible to access. So making sure you have as many on there as possible for as long as you possibly can. I know city websites occasionally mandate a clearing of information to save space, but fighting for that is important. Policy and pattern analysis. So doing analysis of the policies, the trends that you're seeing, the data that's being collected or given to you is really important, so that you have all of the background information and all of the things that support recommendations that you're going to make. And then it is really important to do this piece. It is equally as important to make sure that law enforcement is responding to those recommendations in a timely manner and in writing. And that allows you, as part of your public reporting, to be more clear and have backup on what has been accepted and what hasn't, and as much as you are able, the reasoning why it either has or has not been accepted. That also helps the public. If you have a police department that is listening to you and is accepting the recommendations, talking about implementation and how implementation is going to happen, that's important for the community to know. Conversely, it's also important to know if the police department is not responding to your recommendations, or they're rejecting them all out of hand. And the next two that I'm going to talk about are really the input and the output of your organization. So first we have community outreach. So your community outreach is where you're going to build expectations. It's about making people aware of its existence. So in the summer of 2020, when our phones started ringing off the hook, I cannot tell you how many people we talked to about wanting to establish civilian oversight in their city that already had civilian oversight. And in some cases for decades. And so this made me want to really emphasize this point, is that just because you're there and doing the work, not everybody knows that you're there doing the work. So make sure that word is out about your existence, what you're able to do, also some clear information about what you can't do. Sharing reports, it helps you recruiting volunteers. Lee has an amazing program that I hope at some point he'll tell you all about, where they recruit members of the community to go out, and they become an extension of the oversight entity. And it really, when you are out there in the community, talking to the community, you're developing a greater capacity for problem solving moving forward. So I can't emphasize enough how important that is. But just as important, if not more, is the input piece, community involvement. It is important to make sure that community has a place to put their thoughts and feelings about what's going on in their community. Make sure that community involvement represents the local population's composition and diversity, that that you really think creatively about how you can involve community. I mean, you have a board that, I am assuming, as with most boards, all of you are here because you have strong ties to community. But you probably also have communities in North Miami that aren't represented on your board, and figuring out who can help you reach those communities, and understanding that not everybody wants to come to a meeting or feels comfortable talking about these issues out in the open. And so kind of thinking about how you can talk to communities in different ways will be really important. A great example of this, and how sometimes this can be done through creative process. A great example is New Orleans. So when they developed their mediation program, it is actually developed in collaboration, not only with the police department, but community members. Community members developed the framework of it. And community members were trained to be community mediators. So there was a way there to involve community in a process that didn't originally have an access point for them. You know, most civilian oversight, the access point for civilian oversight involvement is sitting on the board. And that's not that doesn't allow for a lot of people to have an access point. So creating additional ones can really grow trust and legitimacy for your agency. Confidentiality, anonymity, and protection from retaliation. Understanding that when someone comes forward with a complaint, always remembering the courage it took to come forward with a complaint, and making sure that people are protected, that all confidentiality is adhered to on all sides of the complaint, and making sure that there's adequate protection for those who want to file a complaint or come forth with information regarding a complaint, a use of force, an incident of great bodily harm. So really thinking through that and making sure. And I'm not sure if you are allowed, your ordinance doesn't specify, but allowed to accept anonymous complaints?
No.
No?
We don't.
Okay. Okay, anonymous complaints are hard. They're really difficult to investigate. But sometimes that's used as a way for those who are truly frightened to file it. So that'll make it even more important to really kind of figure out how people can feel trust in the process and safe. And lastly, we have procedural justice and legitimacy, which we talked about a little bit yesterday, but we're really talking about civilian oversight needs to really think about how authority is exercised. For those authorities that are established in law, how they use that authority and the perceptions of how fair and neutral, how much voice people have in the process are really important. And like I said yesterday, it's important to apply those concepts or tenets of procedural justice, not only to the work of law enforcement, but also within civilian oversight. The work that you do will be very important to the community, and how you do it will be even more. So that's the end of the 13 principles. I just want to pause here if there are any questions before we move on.
How do we determine the extent of our outreach? Meaning, you said that you might bring things up and then could be completely ignored. What is the recourse? Is there recourse? Like if this situation where we're involved in, whatever the situation might be, I mean, how is it determined, or how do we determine the extension of our reach?
So a lot of if I'm hearing you correctly, and I apologize, my hearing is not good, that great, and I trying to pick up through the owl. So if I'm hearing you right, the extension of your power is really determined through the ordinance itself. And the good news is that the ordinance isn't super specific, and stop me if I'm wrong, Dr. Harris, if you're perceiving this differently, isn't super specific on a lot of things. It does outlay very clearly what your procedures are. But for instance, the work that you do with the community, that's not spelled out word for word in this ordinance. How you conduct your meetings is, although guided by local and state statute, some of those things are not specifically outlined. So you do have some room to kind of push outwards. But if we're talking about how far you can reach, there will be an endpoint, and that endpoint is either the ordinance itself, how it butts up against other things like union contracts, and ultimately what can trump it is then state statute. So those are kind of how you determine how you reach here. And I will say, civilian oversight agencies, even those that we might deem as very effective, hitting all of these 13 to the fullest extent that you could is not, no one is achieving that. It becomes a balance because everybody is subject to the budget that they're given. Or you could have experienced a crisis or a critical incidents that resulted in a crisis for the community, where although the civilian oversight entity has always been doing everything that it's been allowed to do for years, doesn't matter, because now all of a sudden the civilian oversight entity is under fire and the community is upset with them and law enforcement. So it's about this balance of great relationships one day with the stakeholders. Next day, we're going to have to start working on those again. It's about trying to rebuild a budget that's been gutted in a bad year. And so there are some, like procedural justice and legitimacy, that is something that can be yours with, and is not as dependent on external factors. Same with community engagement and involvement. You really have the choice of how and what you do with that. So most oversight agencies tend to concentrate consistently on those that they don't have external factors contributing to how extensive they can move into this principle or lean into this principle, and then try to bring on the others to the extent that they can because of the mandates and the laws that restrict them.
So Cami, to your point, to what Rabbi Lang had mentioned, yes, our ordinance is pretty vague to a certain degree. It's not a lot of concrete that can hold you into a box. And I think Vice Mayor DeSume, and as well as that we had Rodney on here, who's a great instrumental to putting our ordinance together, that when it comes to community outreach, you can go as far as you want, right? And that's why, in essence, ordinance do change. So it may come about that as this work evolves, that we start crafting possibly recommendations to bring to the city council to possibly change the things to the ordinance. As she mentioned, Lee in Atlanta, they have an extension of all these other volunteers, which I forgot about that, Lee, that you have that there, as an extension to other areas to find out, because really interesting about what we were talking about in New Orleans about where these gaps are and how you reach those areas of the gaps that need to know about this work that's happening, or there may be issues, underlying issues that are happening there that we're unaware of. So yes, you have the power and autonomy to kind of look at that as we move forward.
And I would also suggest, in case you're looking for something to read in your free time, so include, in addition to the report that we did on the state of civilian, or the state of the field, we also did 9 case studies on oversight entities across the country. And if you go to our website under resources, and the first tab in the drop-down list is recent reports, you can find links to all of those case studies. The case studies include Atlanta, Miami, New Orleans, and then 6 others: Philadelphia, Los Angeles, Indianapolis, Cambridge. So they're of all different sizes and different types of mechanisms, models of oversight. So that might be really interesting for you. And I know that that program that I was mentioning about Lee's in Atlanta is also detailed in that case study as a effective practice. So something else for you guys to try to fit into your schedules when you have time. So unless there are any other questions, I'm going to move into our next section, stakeholder outreach and engagement. So I know that you all are from the community, of the community, working in the community. And so I know some of this will be a little repetitive or not new information for you, but I did want to give this information to you from a civilian oversight lens. I think it's really important, and this is even for agencies. Your agency has a lot of authority, but I will say that no matter what type of agency I'm talking to, whether it's one that has a tremendous amount of authority and one that has very little, it is really important to focus on the power that you have. And one of the powers that you have consistently, whether you have a lot of power or little, is stakeholder outreach and engagement. Your connections with the community are one of your powers. And it's about kind of focusing on what you can do to really utilize that power in this area that becomes really important, particularly when it feels sometimes like you have little power elsewhere. So let me just jump right into this. So I've been mentioning stakeholders throughout the presentation this evening. And one of the things I like to do is really talk about who are the stakeholders. So community is a stakeholder, elected officials and municipal workers, stakeholders, law enforcement, huge member of your stakeholder group, and media. And so I think elected officials and municipal workers are important, but also fairly, I think it's self-explanatory, and media. Community, though, it's important to remember that community isn't just, let's just go out and have a few community meetings a quarter, and hopefully everybody will come and that'll be good enough. You really need to break down your stakeholder community group into different sections, and every jurisdiction is different. But you can start by kind of pulling these big groups, leaders and organizations, interfaith communities, those who are impacted by law enforcement misconduct, and then also advocates and activists. And then from there, you can break that down even further and make sure that you're reaching all segments of that stakeholder group. I also think that the law enforcement stakeholder group should also have several different subsets. I think that a lot of times it's very easy to think of law enforcement as just one big blob of stakeholder over here, and that's not really the case. You have your union. They're definitely a subset who you may approach very differently than you would command staff and the chief. And then also just line officers. They are approached very differently. And I will say, you know, with some of the groups that I've worked with in the past, they're always amazed that when they go, for instance, to a roll call to talk to particularly a new agency, they're trying to get the word out, trying to help over the law enforcement entity understand that they're not there to, you know, burn everything down and you know, make sure everybody's filing misconduct complaints on every single officer, which is what some of them believe. And so it's amazing going to those roll calls when you talk to the group and then you ask for questions and there's absolute silence until the supervisors leave the room. And then all of a sudden there are all sorts of questions coming out. So trying to have conversations with officers as opposed to supervisors can really produce different conversations and allow people to be more comfortable with the work you're doing in a way that might not otherwise be possible. And then it's also really good to include the union, because they're going to be talking about what you're doing, whether you're talking to them or not. And so trying to have conversations, trying to provide information so that everybody has the same information can help the process along. Now, in some cases, there are situations that are so adversarial that that becomes very difficult, but that doesn't mean it's not worth trying. I've always found that doing something with law enforcement tends to have better results than doing something to law enforcement. Having them at the table as you're doing the work, while still, of course, maintaining your independence, can be very beneficial to the overall outcome of the work that you're doing. So what can stakeholder engagement look like? So stakeholders really do have an interest in what you're doing and how you're doing it. So well-informed and engaged stakeholders can help you to define the work. That's where that input comes in. Listening to stakeholders and knowing what they need from you can help outline and roadmap your work. But it also allows you, by having this engagement strategy, by helping to disseminate your work out there into the community, to law enforcement, so that everybody knows what you're doing and the meaningful work that's happening. So this But this kind of information, back to the input output, really needs to be a two-way process. There has to be the output, but you have to put time together to actually listen. You know, in any workshop that I do on communication with people, any facilitation that I do, it's really important to remember that effective communication involves about 20% talking and 80% listening, which I realize can be very difficult to do, but it's amazing the things that you can learn when you're actually listening. Strong stakeholder engagement improves trust and oversight, and if it's done authentically, it can eventually improve trust in policing. So make sure there's regular communication out to your stakeholders. Make sure you have open meetings. Make sure there are regular updates, and make sure that you have a presence in public. All of those things will help with this stakeholder engagement piece. So several different approaches to engagement. So first of all, there's communication with your base. So, you know, who are those that will benefit and fight for your cause, for the work that you're doing? And that doesn't necessarily mean someone that's going to always think you're right, but someone who appreciates the fact that you need to be there and that oversight is important and imperative to producing better policing. And who is impacted by police misconduct and bad policy? Those are all people who are part of your base. There's also the approach of communication with the larger general public. Who are those that need regular communication but aren't as impacted and will need to understand your cause for the longevity of the organization? Often this is elected officials heavily fall into this category. They very much affect, they need to understand your cause and why it's so important that you're there. So it's also, as a side note, in addition to reaching out, it's always about figuring out how you help promote your need, why you need to be there. And I also will say this, one of the best parts of having all of these amazing people from the community sitting on a board, other than being able to give their input from their perspective, is that also you all know people. You can have conversations with people. You can help build the case for continued, sustained, effective oversight in North Miami. So it's not just about some of this communication happening from the staff. It's also about it coming from board members as well. So something to remember. Communication with your elected and appointed leaders, even when you don't need anything from them, just reminding them that you're there doing the work, carrying on, and then communication with law enforcement. Talking to them about fair and unbiased investigations. Who want to know that if they feel something that's unfair or dangerous to the department, will you be interested in knowing and problem solving with them to correct it? So helping them understand that this can be a collaborative effort, that there can be, that you can sit down and have conversations with them. And then also eventually providing information or community outreach events where you can help facilitate conversations with law enforcement and community members. There are great examples in throughout the country of programs where maybe specifically with youth, where you bring officers and youth together. And then eventually, great example is a program out of Denver, where not only did they bring cops and youth together, but then there's also an outshoot of that program where they bring cops and the parents of those youth together so that the cops can understand better about what it's like to be the parent of a child. and how they feel about when their child is stopped by law enforcement. So all of those things can be very important and different approaches than you might normally think of than the community meeting at the local community center or church. So all of those are just ideas to start thinking outside of the box. In Atlanta, there is, and I'm not going to remember the name of it, but it is cops meet with community members in barbershops. Do you
Yes.
remember, Lee?
Yes, it is Clippers and Cops.
Thank you. I kept thinking cutting and cops, and I couldn't think of the right name. Clippers and Cops, and it's a program that's actually spreading around the country, and it's a great way for cops to meet community members where they are. Now that program was actually started by cops, but it's also something that's been successful enough that, you know, it's something that Lee could promote to the participation to community members.
So Cammy,
Yeah.
I'm not saying that any of our board members, this would apply to them, but if it is the case, as volunteers in the community and obviously serving on a civilian oversight board, how can they feel empowered when you're talking about engaging and having communication with law enforcement, where they may have felt, not them, but just hypothetically speaking, individuals, they feel like, well, why am I going to go talk to law enforcement when they have X amount of years of experience in this field? They studied it, they went to school, they gone through the academy. What can I say to them, right? What value do they bring to the conversation as board members of civilian oversight? Share
So
that.
yeah, so that's a great question. So they bring value in several different ways. One is that it is important, I think, anytime a member of law enforcement can have an interaction with a community member and learn something from it, or be able to teach something from it, that's a positive step. That's building bridges. I am a firm believer in training, including ride-alongs, or for those who don't feel comfortable with ride-alongs, some kind of equivalent immersive experience. Maybe it's just walking with a cop downtown on their beat in the afternoon. But not only doing those types of having that one-on-one time gets you to know each other as people, and just to understand that it's not always that you're all part of the same community, even though you may have very different experiences. And that is incredibly important. And I think the way that it's done, in addition to one-on-one pieces like ride-alongs, I think that another great way to do it is through roll calls, and have board members be able to go and with staff, or sometimes staff just goes, but kind of a rotating cast, going to roll calls and talking to them about what your office and oversight entity does. Because again, I mentioned this when I was talking about unions, someone is telling them what you're doing, and it may not be exactly what you're doing. It may be maybe a more nefarious version of what you're doing, and being able to go out and actually talk to them about what's happening, what you can do, what you can't do, why you're on the board, I think goes a long way to building relationships that then end up in that category of cooperative and collaborative work that can be done between the law enforcement and the CIB. Any other questions? Okay. So communication strategies. So website, you guys have got that down. Email lists. So many offices just anytime they have any event, they collect email addresses, they make sure that people have the ability through their website to sign up for more information, so that you can get, so that when you have newsletters or information about meetings that you want to get out, you have as big a possible of a base as you can to help with turnout. Social media is also really important to get the word out about what you're doing. I will suggest that you develop a social media policy for the agents, for the CIB. You have to be sure that you are, one of the things that we'll talk about fairly frequently in the training is that as part of a civilian oversight agency, it's really important to remember that you're not necessarily there for one side or for the other. You're there for the process. The process has to be what's important. And so as you are working with social media, it is really important not to post about controversial topics, particularly those that are happening in or near North Miami. It can really affect your legitimacy if you do so. Really kind of keep in mind that you are posting to help people understand, to educate, and to invite. Understand, educate, and invite. Those are, and try not to use that social media as a way to editorialize anything.
Good question. You have their email list, right? So you're recommending that on top of what we would have for staff, but recommend to have all the board members come up with a list of stakeholders, constituents. So as we communicate information, we can use whatever system, whether we use MailChimp and so on and so forth. Is that what you're saying there?
Yeah, I think making sure that as many people as possible, with of course the ability to opt out if they choose, will help build that list. And that particularly at the beginning when you're just trying to get people in the door at events. And then also use, if you're having a meeting out in an area, utilizing the community centers, organizations that are doing work in that community, to have them help invite people into those meetings. And then you bring them into your list after they've come, so that you can make sure you're really, that also helps because you're starting to partner with other entities in the community and kind of building your network of support. And at the same time, getting the word out. Does that help? The other one is news outlets, always having that list of members of media who, when you have information, you can push it out to them. I know that with the city, some cities have very strict requirements on how media is press releases are sent out into the world. There are some that require you to go through the city's PIO, but I believe in your case, that's in-house. And so being able to have those connections can be really important with the media. The other thing that I'll mention, and I'll go ahead and pull up the next slide because it somewhat contains information related to that, is that I think it's really important for you to think about how you're conducting meetings too. I mean, how many of us have been to a community meeting where, for instance, we're in some basement or community center where we've got a table up at the front with a panel, and then all the community members are sitting out in the audience, maybe with a microphone, maybe with someone holding a microphone so that they can control how long everyone has the mic. There are cities that have kind of turned that on its head a little bit, where they might have a microphone up in the front of the audience, but no one is sitting at a table to be a panel. That when someone wants to get up and speak, for instance, let's say the chief of police is there to talk about an incident that occurred. The chief is sitting in the audience with community members and then gets up, just like every other community member would have to get up to the mic and speak. It seems so simple, but it puts everybody on a more equal playing field from the beginning, and really tends to, particularly when you have a volatile situation because a crisis has occurred in the community due to a critical incident of some sort, doing what you can to immediately start to put people on an equal playing field, diffuse the situation. I just think I've always, and actually I have to tell you, the new director of the Miami-Dade mechanism, Ursula Price, that is who I learned that technique from. And I think I can't wait till you all have a chance to meet her. She has a million where that came from. But just really trying to turn things around and do things a little different to make people more comfortable. And then also just remember that you're going to have people at your meetings who support you and those who don't. And no matter which end of the spectrum they fit in, it's important to make everybody feel comfortable and welcome at the meeting. Make sure, particularly since these are normally after work, make sure there's food and drinks where you can. Make sure there's childcare. Make sure there's printed materials, and also the content is projected so that people have multiple ways of seeing it. If you know that you're going into a meeting, that you make sure that you have the necessary translators there so that everyone can hear and understand what's being said. Make sure that there's time for public comment. And then also make sure that no matter what the situation is, how much they're supporting you or not supporting you, that you're employing grace and empathy and connection to everyone that's there. Everybody's coming with something that's driving them and trying to really figure things out, and it's important for them to find a place where they can feel heard, and so that turns into eventually them supporting the work that you're doing. One of the almost the last thing I'm going to tell you is about regular stakeholder updates. So think of creative ways to engage with the community. You know, there's health fairs. One of the ideas I always love is going to schools and partnering with someone who you can talk about civilian oversight, and partnering with an organization that can do some know your rights training. You know, knowing that you don't have to do all the community events yourself, that you can partner with others and make it something that has additional meaning to the people who are attending. Communicating with or engaging with law enforcement through ride-alongs, going to roll calls, going to safety fairs. Most districts have some kind of advisory committee, making sure that you're connecting with them. Staff also being able to get a training slot at the academy, so that part of all of their training involves knowing more about civilian oversight. And then also make sure that you're engaging with your elected officials and appointed officials, inviting them to your meetings, allowing them to give quick updates at your meetings. And then when they're doing that, ask them if you can do the same, to make sure everybody has a chance to learn about what everybody's doing. And then also, you know, get fancy. Creating a youth or advisory group. I mentioned Denver's earlier. Another great program is out of this Civilian Complaint Review Board in New York City, where they have youth who are in the program from middle school on up. And I will say, a lot of times when I start mentioning like CCRB in New York, people are like, oh, no, we're not them. It is an enormous agency. And, they have a police force that are bigger than some of the towns and cities that I work with. However, everything is scalable. Just because someone's big or small, if they have a good idea, it's worth looking at. So if you guys are interested in things like that, I can absolutely give you the name of the people that are running that program in New York.
Tammy,
Yeah.
Another quick question to ask.
Yeah.
One of our youth is here. So Josh is the person who's been volunteering, and he worked with us as a summer intern, and he's just really gravitated. So I've always been glad to have him participate with us. One thing I wanted to bring up, and sometimes, and this happened to us when I was with the city of St. Pete, was some of our board members that were convened, it seemed as if across the community, they start feeling like this is not really a transparent or fair process, because I'm starting to see so many of our board members so involved and engaged with our law enforcement and police. So they feel like, I can't trust you, So talk from that angle, because it's important to have that engagement, do those ride-alongs, have those conversations with the police department, work together. We're here to help support one another, but also create it in a way to where it feel like the community can still come and trust and have conversations. And that they feel like if they wanted to provide information, they don't feel like it's a conflict of interest per se. Did you hear my question? Or are you frozen? Are you frozen, Tammy? Tammy, you're frozen. That's a heavy question. That's right. Come back to us, Tammy. Come back to us. Oh, gosh.
Hey, Dr. Harris, if as soon as Cammie comes back on, I just want to make a comment real quick about that question.
Perfect. Absolutely.
That is a serious balancing act that you have to always be mindful of, because the communities, they are really looking at the oversight agency because of usually a lack of trust of the other police department. And so when they're challenged with, seeing the oversight agency appearing to be too close, that does cause concern. But that relates back to the education piece, the community understanding.
Hi, everyone. I apologize. I just got the blue screen of death on my computer. So now I'm on my 10-year-old's Zoom account. So I'm actually not switching over to be Lucy here. So let's start from where we left off. And I think Dr. Harris, you were asking a question.
All right, so Lee was actually starting to address the question that I asked, which was related to how it's a balancing act between how engaged are you with the police department to where the residents and community don't feel as if you're not an independent entity, that they feel like they could trust you, that they could feel like they can come share this information with you because of whatnot. So that's what Lee was starting to talk about, and we wanted you to kind of share your expertise of direction and guidance to the group.
Okay, and I apologize. Can you pose the very first part of that question again? I could not hear. I didn't have my audio working yet. When you started.
Audio working? Can you hear me?
Yeah, it's working now. I can hear you now.
Okay. So the question was, when I was in the city of St. Petersburg, when we had our review board, we were very much engaged in connecting with our police department, doing ride-alongs, giving updates. They were coming to our meetings, they were going to their meetings. However, residents started feeling like, oh man, I feel uncomfortable to come talk to our review board because the fact that, are you guys the same agency? Like, what's going on? I thought this was supposed to be this independent forum for being able to address my issues that I had. So can you address to our board as best practices, as a balancing act? That's what Lee was starting to talk about too as well, but from your expertise around that.
Yes. So what I found, that can be a very real experience for people. It can even be difficult for board members to feel sometimes like they can speak freely if there are officers always there. But in regards to community meetings, a lot of times what I see oversight entities doing is they may invite officers to their meetings to, if there's a specific topic, like perhaps you have someone from the canine unit come and speak about procedures specific to canines, the canine unit, and really use that as law enforcement is there to help with communicating and educating on specific topics. I would have meetings with law enforcement or engaging with them separately, so that there are not huge groups of law enforcement that show up at community meetings. And I think also you need to be willing to have the conversation with law enforcement that says, look, this is how the community feels. And so we need to figure out a way where we can get you in front of the community, but they also understand that we're a neutral body that's not working for you. We're not part of your agency, but that, and so that also your officers know that we're not part of just the community, and we're just there for the community. It's a really delicate balance. And people in oversight often joke about, if you're doing your job really well, someone is always really upset with you. Because if you're trying to be in the middle and do what's right, one side or the other of the 40 sides that are coming at you, one side or another is going to feel like you are working with or for the other side, and that it will go back and forth depending on the situation. But I do think trying to have community meetings where you might invite law enforcement to speak on a specific topic, but make sure that they're not always the center of attention in the meetings that you're having, and that you're also having meetings where there might not be any law enforcement there.
All right, Lee, you wanted to elaborate?
No, actually, I was following it. That's exactly what I was saying. Tammy, while you were out, I wanted to just chime in real quick on that question. And so I was basically saying, the same thing about the balancing act and being mindful of how you have those interactions with the police department, because it's not only when you're talking about planned events, but it's also just out in the community at other people's events. So you just have to think about that in the conversations that you're having. And even when you're being, one of the interesting, and I'm going to shut up, but one of the interesting things is people's perceptions of your friendliness with law enforcement sometimes can create feelings that are concerning for some other members of the community. I mean, at the end of the day, we have to have relationships with law enforcement to get our work done effectively. But we do have to be mindful of what does this image look like by someone who's coming to us with the problem, so we have to think about that when we're doing our stuff.
Thanks for that, Lee. So let me get my,
You should be able to share.
yeah, let me just, let me see if it will let me bear with me for a minute. Have to allow it to share. While I'm working on that, let me just finish talking a little bit about when I was talking about getting fancy and the youth programs. Find proactive ways to document public safety issues and challenges for sharing at meetings or social media. Also, don't be afraid to participate in media interviews, but it is as the slide in your packet says, make sure that when you're getting interviewed, that it is about the work that you're doing overall and not about specific cases, even though that is more than likely not why you get invited to do the interview, but trying to make sure that you're talking about the overall work and not specifics is really important. Choose topics and themes for public meetings. So I've had a lot of conversations recently with oversight entities who have found that, and we started talking a little bit about this last night, actually, that people aren't coming to their meetings anymore. There's nothing driving them there, and it makes it really difficult to sit in a room with your fellow board members all by yourself month after month, with it seeming as if no one cares what you're doing. And so having themes where you can talk about, in addition to, maybe you have a month where you don't have a lot of business to take care of, and you can make official business anyway, but you could make part of the meeting, again, like a know your rights training, where you have someone come in and discuss information like that then brings additional interest from the community to see what's going on at that meeting. Guest speakers are great to provide information and also to draw people in. So I would also consider that as a creative community engagement strategy. Then also asking people to partner in problem solving. Making sure people know that you want to hear from them, you want to partner with them, and that the problems that you're trying to solve in some cases are much bigger than one agency, one staff of 3. They require the help of board members and community members, elected officials. It's about bringing people in and engaging with them so that you're not having to try to solve all the problems by yourself. That will also be very helpful to you as you move forward. The next thing I wanted to do before we move on to reporting is I just wanted to hear from all of you a little bit about what kind of engagement strategies you would like to see for the CIB.
I'll go ahead and start it off. I appreciate the information that you've given thus far. My mind has been going about what could we potentially do as a board to get people engaged. As you mentioned, so we won't be sitting here month after month for long, talking amongst ourselves. One thing obviously that immediately came to mind, engagement with the coffee with a cop. That's something that the city already has. That's something that a lot of cities have. We can potentially link ourselves to that and become engaged. Also, maybe some type of event where we team up with the state attorney's office doing an expungement day at / job fair. As we know, a lot of the times people that fall victim and often become victims and people that seek the help of citizen investigative boards or panels across the United States, people that they may not have a job, they may be marginalized citizens, returning citizens. That could possibly be an area that we might be able to help out and be a resource for that particular community to alleviate problems before they even start to hatch. Another thing also, what you just alluded to, what you just mentioned, a know your rights type of camp or a day, or maybe you can have a speaker here in house to come in, and that can be a draw. Because a lot of times when people get stopped by the police or interact with an officer, there's no training about what to do, really. You just do whatever the officer asks you to do. You think, well, officer told me to do it, I should do it. Or sometimes you think, I don't have to do that, and yes, you're legally obligated to do that, and then boom, a problem arises. So I think knowing your rights is something that's extremely important, something that we could contribute to helping with, and might be really good for putting us out there and letting the community know that we're here to serve.
Great ideas. Thank you for sharing those. Anyone else?
Yeah, Pierre Charles here, and to just piggyback on what Chair just said, I also believe we need to start thinking on how we're going to go out there and let the community know that we are here and we are working. So we need to set up some meetings, just get out of our comfort zone and go out there and let them know that we are here and working throughout the city. And not exactly working against our police force, but just work there just to make sure that the voice is being heard, and if there's a complaint, that it's gonna be addressed the way it's supposed to be and everything. So I think we need to start thinking of a way to let the community know that we are here, we exist, and we are working, and we're on their side and trying to help and make sure that we are striking the balance. So I think but I wanted to add it in addition to what the chair just said.
Great. Thank you for that, Pierre. Anyone else?
I was thinking about the faith-based places, like the churches, before and after the masses. So they are different. I mean, we don't have any barrier. We have to be open to go to all the denominations and corners where they are, go and meet with them to let them know that we exist now and we are there to follow. They need someone to talk.
I think one of the things that would be very helpful early in the ballgame would be an information card, not linked to our names individually, but an expanded business card, so that as we travel about the community, we can place the card in people's hands. For example, the local barber shop, everybody has to get their haircut, and everybody goes to a different barber somewhere in this town. And some of the grocery stores, you get more grocery stores than Carter has peanuts these days. And they seem to be on just about every street corner. And there's all kinds of interactions that we have on a daily and weekly basis. So a card that would have the city's website, any other communication media that we're using, and the purpose of the CIB as an independent entity. And establish that so that homeowners meetings, when they take place, that kind of ended with COVID, but it will come back over time. So again, it isn't linked to us as an individual, but for this entity, for the CIB, so that we have something people can stick on the refrigerator. This kind of thing, refrigerator magnet concept. Sure, there's a bunch of costs on these things, but you got to have a way to people have to know who we are and how to reach out. And yeah, I know everybody has cell phones, but I know far more people than I actually have in my contact list in my phone. I just can't begin to get everybody in there, much less remember that I put them there. Example of community outreach at my house, my husband does Halloween on a grand scale, and I do mean on an amazingly grand scale. And so on Halloween night, we opened our front yard to the neighborhood. We had people coming out of the woodwork to walk through and take up handfuls of candy. And we had personal friends in the backyard and members of the public in the front yard. This kind of thing creates a great opportunity for a little table and pass on the cards as people come through.
What about the generator?
Well, you know, that's going to come when we finish, remodeling the backyard. I'm really hoping by the end of March that we'll be able to do that again. I did have 199 people a couple of years back at a party. And it's not a grand house, it's just how we utilize the yard. And I have no problem opening up my yard to entertain. In fact, I'm currently planning a champagne and strawberry event for a selected group of people I'm involved with, so that we get past the new year. So, you know, I do these different things. And very happy to utilize that forum. But you gotta have somebody give people, right? So that they hand out some kind of a card. I don't know what the refrigerator magnets cost. I suppose they're prohibitive in the first year.
No, it's okay. We already had put out a price code for something like that.
So
We'll have a QR code.
the sooner we can get those things in our hands in some reasonable quantity, the sooner we can begin developing our own creativity on outreach. So I just throw that out and say, you know, we need the tool. We all meet people. It's a matter of having something to give them to remind everybody.
I see in terms of,
Okay.
I think we still somehow listed up the city and we don't have our own website, is that?
We
what
have
still have?
our website is city's website, so it's
Right.
city website, so North Miami FL/CIB, so that's our page, so it's built out. I showed you, it's fully built out now with everything.
Is there a way to just, I mean, we talk about independence, and I think, you know, that was covered, you know, extensively. I mean, is there a way to just move the way, you know, getting our own independence?
I think the only thing they allowed us was under the social media piece. And that's a conversation I further with the city manager and then and communication, for us to create a standalone website. Because we are the city, we're not like a CRA, we're not separate like a CRA, right? We are. part of the city.
Well, according to the census, I think we are 62,000 residents thus far, and roughly about 30,000 registered voters, maybe 28,000 registered voters. Department of Elections have everybody's email, everybody's telephone number. So in terms of reaching out to the individuals and the residents, I think, you know, it's a great idea. You know, order that data, then you could upload it into your contact list. Then you have at least, you know, in the beginning, you know, 30,000 emails and 30,000 telephone numbers, but the unregistered voters, there may be other ways to contact them. Even the city has not done, you know, what we're talking about here in terms of, you know, getting in contact with their own residents, but we, so many of us here that's been involved and engaged in this community, so we know that these kind of things they have worked, and we could actually, I mean, Department of Election, all you have to do is just order the data. I mean, it's, you know, if you get 28,000 registered voters with their email and telephone numbers, I don't even think it's gonna cost you $100. Yeah. In addition to that, the city's website, they have on the faith-based organizations, they all registered in the city. I think the last time I checked, they were at 100. Well, I may be able to get into that. Maybe there's more. There's about 100 of them, and all of them have their emails, they have their telephone numbers listed and the address. So this is another way we could actually add that into our constant contact and basically, you know, reach them, you know, that way. In addition to that, you also have to look on your local vendors in the city, and the local vendors, a lot of times, you know, most of the people that work for them live in the city and work in the city. So this is another way that we could start spreading the news who we are and what we're doing for the city of North Miami. So, and I see, you know, we have I think, what is it, 8 or 9 homeowners association in the city of North Miami. So, and the meetings, you know, public listed. So this is another way we could get more in contact, you know, some of the residents and let them know must be something going on, are we really independent? Are we really doing the work for the community? So I would rather see the board closely aligned with the community rather than more closely aligned. If we had a choice, I'm not sure if we can get there, but I would like to see more like community based, and I think we have a great police force, probably one of the best in the country. I mean, they recently just probably the best chief, in the country, hands down, very involved with the community, very supportive of what Flying is doing. But I just, the board really have to be independent and keep in mind, we're not, it is an investigative board, but we there just to make sure that we have synergy.
Question, do we have, or rather, maybe yes, but do we have an organized faith, interfaith council here in North Miami by chance? I just asked that because obviously in Broward, public place something, and very large interfaith council.
We've got like for Hanukkah coming up. My synagogue. And I have a meeting, meet at my synagogue. And where I have to meet with the police department. Challenge, because no matter how many 30 years ago, we had a challenge program. There's constantly a new sergeant that's in charge, but he was never. But there's an opportunity for chaplains to have the various things involved that could certainly help the meeting. Let us know that something is going on, because people would very often go to their clergy, tell them about the problem that might be existing, and again, friends, I'm slightly biased, the chaplain for the over 30 years. That would a number of them as colleagues. Don't disagree with, but I think it's important in both groups. I think it sounds like people are afraid to associate. I understand the perception, but I think it's also important to mention that not just complaint, but also commendation, praise. I think it's very important. It's a very thin line. I would say I'm also white. That makes it a lot easier as far as conflict. I've listened to a lot of people speak about having their children. Fear that the child is out, people will go to that. But here's not happening. Predominantly black officers. So there's not as much divisiveness because there's need and not as much fear. So I think somehow just working together on some level benefit all of us.
Well, thank you everyone for all of those contributions. One of the things I'd like to suggest is that as you continue to move forward, that you develop almost really a community outreach strategy plan, where you start to not only list all of these ideas, but also phases. You can't do everything all at once. There may be some things that need to happen where initial strategy involves building trust, particularly in those communities where it might not exist currently, so that you can move on to where you have more interactive community meetings. And then also start listing all of the places that you mentioned this evening, others that come to mind, where then you can start, because not just a couple of you can do these outreach events, and staff can't do them all either. They'll need help, and it's really good for the community to see members of the community out there. And so making sure that different people are signing up for different events, or if someone has a connection with a community center saying, I can set this up. Having a plan like that, I think, will be very helpful, particularly as you're getting started. And that's definitely something that staff could help with, but it's really going to be, its overall success is going to be dependent on everybody chipping in, particularly if you have a small staff, it's a new agency, and it's so important to get the word out and start getting engaged. Anything else that anybody wanted to say before we move on? I think we can get through the last part this evening. It's a fairly short training section. Ready to move on? Okay. I switched back to the other computer that unfortunately booted back up because I'm regretting putting all of those controls on my children's computer now because I could not get anything to be shared. So hopefully this will work a little bit better on my computer. Okay, recommended reporting practices. So if you remember earlier when we were talking about the 13 principles, one of the things was public reporting as a very important principle. So I just want to talk to you briefly about what that can look like. So first of all, as a general rule, reports should contain the mission of the agency, what your authority is, the activities, what you've been up to, and then your accomplishments. You know, how many community accomplishments can look like a lot of different things. It can be how many community members did you engage with over the course of the year? How many policy recommendations? But also when we're talking about backing up and talking about activity, how many cases did you review, or how many cases did the office investigate? All of those things will be incredibly important. And definitely don't forget that when you make a recommendation and it's accepted, celebrate those wins. Let the public know about it. So data should be published and presented in a very clear and accessible manner. Although some of the things that you're dealing with in those reports are very complicated, try to make them so that anybody who's picking up these reports are going to be able to understand them. Also, make sure that if you're sending a report out into the world, make sure that you're also setting up some of your community engagement meetings to present it, so that you have opportunities where people can ask questions about its content, particularly those topics that are in there that might be a little bit more complicated. I mean, not everybody, even as members of a civilian oversight board, you come to this with a lot of knowledge about a lot of things. Maybe the intricacies of civilian oversight or law enforcement are not something that everybody is incredibly knowledgeable about. And so making sure that the community has the opportunity to learn just as you are is really important. I think it's also, well, let's get to the next slide about special reports. So in addition to your annual report, I think doing special reports, particularly when there is a significant investigation, matters of significant community interest, doing one-off reports is also really important. A great example of this is if there is an assessment of an analysis done of, for instance, use of force reporting. It's actually an real example from the New York Police Department's Office of the Inspector General. So they did They did an analysis of use of force reporting, and then after doing so, they came up with a list of at least 30 some recommendations for changes to how use of force was reported, the changes to the form on which it was reported, the different things that should be required and mandated in the process. And when they made this recommendation, they also accompanied it with a report so that the public could also see the results of their analysis and the recommendations that were made. As it turns out, the police department, I believe, accepted all of the recommendations. So 2 years later, they did another analysis to see if those recommendations had actually, in fact, been implemented, which they had. But then they also did analysis on the effect those recommendations had on the overall process. It's also good to know, did they have the effect that you thought they would? Were there improvements? Is there maybe room for additional recommendations or tweaks to the process? So doing those follow-up reports is also very important. And it also provides kind of honesty in the work. Not everyone gets everything right the first time. It's all about the intent of trying to improve things and make them better. But also sometimes in that improvement process, you find out that, well, that didn't work the way we thought it should. And then collaborating with the department, coming up with maybe a better solution. Now that the one that you'd recommended had been tried out, maybe everybody sees maybe a clearer path to a better process. So having all of this in a special report also brings transparency to the process, not only to law enforcement, but also to yours. So again, I can't emphasize enough how important it is to make sure that data is out there regularly. In some cases, well, and it also depends on what data you're able to publish by law. That's an incredibly important part when putting these reports together. It may not be that you can put into print publicly all of the information that you'd like to, but you can, making an effort to publish everything you are allowed to by law, can make for a really good report and also provide information that the community really wants to know.
So Cammie, to that point, and we spoke about it yesterday, when Reggie was here, we were talking about our new case management system that we built from Clarity Value. So we'll be able to produce dashboards. So say, for example, each quarter, we want to be able to see where our cases are happening, what type of cases are occurring, what parts of the district throughout the city. So the data is going to be able to populate based on how we built it as an index. So that's a really good benefit that we'll have for you all moving forward.
That's great. And having information so easily accessible is fantastic. So the last thing I want to say about reports is that, just kind of in closing, remember that issuing reports is important because it gets the information out there, but it's really important to your credibility, making sure people know what you're doing. And then I think yesterday, one of the answers to one of the questions involved the fact that, when there's nothing happening, I mean, there's always something happening behind the scenes, but when there isn't something that's getting a lot of attention, people tend to kind of stop watching for a while. And then if something happens, then all of a sudden you're under the spotlight. And making sure that you have reports that show all of this work that has continued to happen, whether people were watching or not, can be really important someday. So that's just one small reason to do reports. I mean, really the bigger reason is to make sure that the community has access to this type of information. It's a way to get out the work you're doing to the world in a way that otherwise they just wouldn't know all the work that's going into things on a day-to-day basis. I should also note that reports should not be censored. or modified by law enforcement or political stakeholders. I know that sometimes reports will be reviewed by independent counsel, which you have in other cases when agencies don't have independent counsel, then it's the city attorney. But having them review it to make sure you haven't put anything in there that could be problematic legally, that's a little different than being censored. You want to make sure that you haven't overstepped the bounds of the legality of the information that you're putting in a public report. Make sure that it is accessible as possible, given the topics that you're presenting. And always put as much information as you can. Don't think that you're overwhelming people with information. It's important to put as much as you can, as can be disclosed by law, into those reports. So with that, and I believe we're about at time here, I will open it up again one more time for questions before we conclude.
No questions from me, but I really do appreciate the presentation tonight. A lot of valuable information once again has been shared. I appreciate it.
My pleasure. And just know that if you have questions, the last slide in your packet on every day is my email. Please don't, if you have questions that come up between now and when we see each other on the 12th, please don't hesitate to email. I'm happy to answer any questions that you have as you're moving forward.
Sounds good. So any unfinished business that we need to address at the moment?
Pending calendar, Saturday is the community bike ride. Good chance to show up, ride your bike, put on your shirt, make your presence known.
So there was something I brought up about getting another shirt, right? You like it so much, right? All right. So we already contacted the vendor. We're trying to go ahead and order you another one.
Are we leaving this year tonight or we taking?
Oh, you can leave it tonight. Well, because she's going to email us the new. Cam, you're going to email us the new product for Monday, the materials.
Yes, I'll have that for you tomorrow.
So if you want to take, if you all want to take everything with you, so if you want to study and read it over and everything, you can take it, and then we'll bring everything with you on Monday.
Can I just say one thing?
Sure. Yeah, absolutely.
When we talk about, what are your rights, as far as the community, what are your rights? I'm all for like educating people on what their rights are. But I think when we do that, they need to be educated on how to exercise those rights. And sometimes you get empowered.
Yeah, no,
with
sure.
knowing-
Tone, are you talking about like tone?
Right.
So,
The other way to look at it is you've got to balance rights with responsibility. Well, what I'm saying is because you know you're right and an officer asks you to do something and you take an aggressive tone with him that I don't have to do that, I know my rights. He may not know that you do have that right. So now you've escalated a situation where it shouldn't even be that. So I think the community, that we should all know what our rights are, how to exercise them. And I think the officers need to know that they do have that right. I don't believe a lot of officers know what those rights are. I mean, just by my experience, I just don't think they know. They think that I'm the guy with the badge, you do what I tell you. It's not always that way. So
they're in line to walk. So.
right. But I think if both sides are educated, then it kind of makes it easier.
Or better interaction.
Right. There's no escalation because that's the way it all starts. That you refuse to do what I tell you. Now I'm snatching you out of the car and.
I appreciate that. Any next steps that we need to address at the moment?
Chair,
Yes.
I forgot to tell you. So for the, when I send the slides to DeAndrea and Dr. Harris tomorrow, There will also be some handouts. One of them is a case, kind of a made up case and investigation. It's not very long, but you all, maybe we can work on it so that you can receive it by email prior to the meeting, so that you can read through it, because definitely we'll be talking through it. We'll have another, you won't have to listen to me the full couple of hours next week, which you may all be very happy about. We'll have another gentleman, Jason Wechter, who will be joining us, who's been an investigator in civilian oversight for a few decades, who will be talking us through a case. And
So
so that
we'll send the case study to them in advance, so they'll have it
Great.
over. the beginning.
I appreciate that, and I'll mark that. I'll tell you which one it is. That's all I have. Thank you.
Thank you, too. Thank you. I don't think we have any public comments, any other concerns?
Just a few things. One is, in addition to sending us, the notices, is it something that you guys can do, send us a calendar invite of this meeting? I don't know, because me, I have to send my assistant, and she should get it, then put it on the back calendar.
What we asked for yesterday is if you have an assistant too, we can send it to your assistant as well to put on the calendars as well.
Right.
So you cover your bases.
Right.
You can do that.
So you can reply back to your sister's email if you want to, and then I save her email and then I can send it to her.
Okay, not a problem. So I think that's, okay. And, secondly, pleasure to see all the superstars, on this board. I have several boards in my life for the last, maybe 40 years, and
You got your
and starting with you, when I was in middle school and high school. So I've been doing this for 40 years, and I'm glad to see, sitting around with professionals that want to see the good for the community. So happy to be part of this board. Pleasure to see most of my friends here. I've been working with them for about 20 years, and you guys are one of the best investigators around town. I have worked with Reginald Hope for 25 years. Okay, basically he does very good work. So appreciate to see him as our investigator for this board. All right.
Can I have a motion to adjourn?
So
Thank you guys for coming.
And you guys can take the,
Bye, everyone. See you next week.
place cards and the highlighters, and I'll bring those back tomorrow.
Okay.